Good morning and welcome to Photo Motorcyclist. Today we're going to be talking about cameras and using a motorcycle to show how they work because this is a motorcycle channel. Today we will be using a Sony 50mm 1.8 lens. As you can see, if it focuses properly, that's what it says on the lens. This is an E-mount mirrorless. The 1.8 rating is how wide the aperture can get. That is the f-stop. That's the rating besides the zoom angle, or the depth of field, basically is what that number is. The f-stop rating is the lowest that the lens can go, and that's what they rate lenses at. Because most lenses don't have a problem making a really small hole in the blades, but they do have a problem making a big hole in the blades. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but it isn't. And it's also a rating for how well the camera can process light. It's also what they call the speed of the lens, which I don't fully understand. But I suppose it means it can expose quicker because it has more light in it. This is a really fancy camera, and I'm going to show you a picture on the screen right about now. It is recording on this little blue thing, aquamarine. This is full auto. He got the gold, which is, I don't know, it's full auto but better. I have not yet to figure out what that is. The P stands for basically program auto, which gives you some freedom. You can control the shutter speed and the aperture at the same time, but you don't have full control. I never personally use that because it's weird. You have the A setting, which controls just the aperture, and the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to keep the right exposure, or what the camera thinks is the right exposure. Shutter speed is the opposite of that. It just controls the shutter, and then it adjusts the aperture to where it thinks it should be. The M, which might look like a W in the picture because this whole thing spins, is full manual, where you control everything, and that's what I pretty much leave it on unless I'm recording video. That little wide, weird looking thing is a panoramic. It's like you do with your cell phone, where you pan across and you get a really super wide picture. Not sure why these have it, but it's kind of neat to play with. You almost have to use a tripod. And then the CSN, scene, is just kind of a thing on top of auto mode where you can make it look old-timey, black and white. It's basically the options on like a cell phone, whereas at nighttime, daytime, sunset, that's what that is. Firstly, you should know what shutter speed is. It's how long the shutter is open, that it is exposed to the image. So if you have an openly long shutter speed and the camera moves, it's blurry. The longer the shutter speed, the more light's let in, and if there is movement, the more blurry you get. Aperture is how far open the blades in the lens are. The wider the aperture, the smaller the f-stop. The f-stop is what they use to measure aperture. The wider it is, the more light's let in, so you have to usually run a quicker shutter speed to adjust for it, or a lower ISO. And also, the wider the shutter is open, the shorter depth of field you have. Which means if you were to, like the camera's focused on me right now, but with a really wide low aperture or low f-stop, if you focused on me, the background would be completely blurry. And anything that would come up in the camera would be completely blurry. The distance window you have to focus is much smaller. If you shrink that aperture way down, which is a high f-stop, basically everything's just in focus. And it also darkens the image, and you have to adjust for that. ISO is basically how sensitive the camera is to light. It's really the only light setting you can adjust independent of what the lens is doing. And you want to use the lowest ISO possible, because when you get up in the higher ISOs, you get film grain and distortion. So the general rule is shoot for the lowest ISO that you can for what you're shooting. Now we're going to take a second, put this lens on the camera, and the rest of the video is going to be handheld, so hopefully I don't shake it too much. Okay, the first thing we're going to show you is how the aperture blades work. Since I could do that without the bike running, you'll understand what I mean in a little bit. This is f/22, which is as narrow as this aperture gets. I got an aperture priority mode. There's f-stop 10, so it should adjust the automatically adjust the shutter speed, and it's having problems focusing. And there's f1.8, that's as wide as it gets. And you can see it's having some issues this close, because this is not a macro lens. There we go. That's what physically happens with the little blades. And you notice that when it's farther in, it's able to focus because the depth of field is so wide, it doesn't have a problem focusing on the lens. When I back it out, the depth of field gets narrower, and when I get past about f2, it can't focus anymore unless I bring it way back. Plus, it's focusing on a mirror and not on the actual, what it's looking at. It's trying to focus on the mirror, not the reflection that's in the mirror. And this bike does need to be washed horribly. So what I'm going to do is, I need to find something. Let's go with the, I was going to use the mirror, but it doesn't want to seem to work. I suppose I could use the tripod. But there we go, this'll work. Let's crank the aperture all the way up. Oops. Let's focus on that little smiley face. See how everything's in the background is nice and in focus, right? And the pictures aren't going to be that high quality because I am in auto mode. I might touch them up. But now let's bring it all the way down to f1.8. See how everything in the background's blurry? That's how the aperture, or the f-stop, works. We're slowly bringing it up. I usually record at about do things at about f14 personally. Now I'm going to do this quick in full manual mode without taking pictures, just to show you what happens. Okay, we are at ISO 200, which is low. The 100 is as low as it'll go. And we're going to drop the aperture, raise the aperture all the way up to f22. See how it got darker? The shutter speed is 1/25th of a second. We bring it down to about 1/40th to adjust for the brightness, and that also makes it a much slower shutter speed. And this, with a 50mm lens, is about a little slow. I would probably get some camera shake. Now if I were to bring it all the way down to f1.8, so you can't even see anything, we need to raise the shutter speed way up to compensate at about 1/2500th of a second, and this would make a pretty sweet picture. From an artistic standpoint, it would kind of suck, because why would you make everything blurry? But that's besides the point. If we go over an ISO, this is 100. You're essentially doubling the light every time. That's 400, 800. I like to shoot at 100, but we're in the shade right now. We're back to full automatic, which is what most people with these cameras use until they figure out how to play with all the manual settings. The next thing we're going to do is shutter speed, so I'm going to have to put this back on the tripod quick. Now if you see how much more zoomed in this is, the tripod didn't move. I had to move the camera a little bit. The lens that was on there at the beginning of the video was a 15 to 55, I believe, millimeter zoom. This is a prime lens, which means it doesn't have zoom. Prime lenses tend to be better lenses. They're less complicated, they tend to have lower f-stop ratings, they just tend to be better and sometimes more expensive lenses. A 50mm like that's on here is known as a portrait lens, because when you have your pictures taken for prom or school yearbook or weddings, they almost always use the lenses on the camera right now. But you can see the difference between this and what it was. But to show the shutter speed, we're going to fire up how the shutter speed works. We're going to fire up the bike. You noticed it's on the rear stand. We're going to get the wheels spinning. We're going to have a little bit of fun. Hopefully the bike's not too loud. That's another reason I got the 50mm on there, so I get a little farther away. Oh yeah. And the kickstand's down. Okay, we are on shutter priority now. There we go. This is a really high shutter speed. Video is a little strange how this works. But I'm going to take a picture at 1/4000th of a second to show you. It'll look like the wheel's completely frozen. Now we're going to slowly drop it down and you'll see a little more blur. In the video. Shutter speed affects video on these cameras really weird. We're at 1/60th now. We start dropping below 1/60th, which comes up to 60 frames per second, which is what we're recording at. But look at there, that's 125, it's 1/20th, 1/15th. You start getting this weird kind of blurry effect, right? One-eighth, 1/6th, and we just keep going. The lowest we can record is 1/4 of a second right there. See how it's all nice and blurry? Let's take a picture of this. And let's bump it back up till about a solid 60 frames a second here, which is 1/60th. And we'll show you what that looks like taking a picture of that. Now these cameras go all the way down to like 1 solid minute. I could do that, but I'd have to really adjust the tripod in order to do that. So, but you can, with the bulb function, which this has, you can have the shutter open as long as you want. It's just that the longer it's open, the more light's let in. You could have a little bit of fun with this. If I put my neutral density filter, which is just a filter that goes on the front of the lens, that controls, it's like sunglasses for a camera, basically. Which means you can, in daylight, you can have wider shutter speeds, lower aperture, higher apertures, which you don't know why you'd want that, and still do some of that like long shutter speed photography in the daytime. Something else I should take note of before I put this lens back on. The zoom lenses, which this one starts at 18. I was wrong, it's 18, not 13. And it goes up to 55mm. You see on the bottom of that lens, this is a 3.5 to 5.6, 18 to 55mm. Obviously the 18 to 55mm is the zoom. The 3.5 to 5.6 is the aperture, or the f-stop rating. Now, 3.5 is the lowest aperture at 18, 5.6 is the lowest aperture it can have, or widest aperture, at 55. Because with lenses, specifically, especially zoom lenses, since there's more moving parts, the farther out you get the zoom, it affects something in there, and the lenses can't be as open. You'll see that if I won't do it, because it would be a nightmare in that mirror. But you'll have the aperture is open at 3.5, and as you zoom, you get to a certain point, the camera will automatically start to close the blades to compensate, because it can't be open with it zoomed out. Plus, you might get a halo around the edge. You'll notice that if I were to put the lens cap, which is like this one, on this lens, you get a really nice halo because the lens picks this up. So instead we use this lens, which is what I use on that camera, the one we're recording with all the time. It's got these cutouts so it doesn't show up in the film. Thank God this lens is off the camera. You see, there's a reason we don't use 50 millimeters for video recording. It's good for taking pictures, but it's not good for video recording. There's the lens that was on there, and you'll notice a lot of people do this. People will do this while taking pictures, but I honestly don't know why. You can put the lens cap on backwards for storage, and that's usually what I do. And then you got the little Sony lens cap, which is okay, I suppose, but it can be a bitch sometimes. It is a nice sunny day, the birds are chirping. There's a general rule for shutter speed as far as handheld cameras go. Depending on who you ask, they'll say it's either 1.5 or 2.5%, the percentage of either what zoom you were at or what lens you're using. There's a word for that. It's called... I don't remember. I'd have to look that up. But like the lens that was on there, the 50 millimeter, I've noticed myself that 1.5 is a much more realistic number to go by. I don't know where the 2.5 comes from. Yes, bird. Thank you. But I like the 1.5. So basically 50, and then half of 50 is 25, so 75. A shutter speed of 1/75 of a second is about as low as you're going to want to go. As long as you're not running around with the camera, just standing taking pictures, where you won't have to worry about blur from the camera moving in your hands while taking pictures. You can get a little lower than that. If you're using a monopod, or if you got really steady hands, you can usually get down to close to what the zoom for your camera lens actually is sometimes, but the general rule is 1.5 to not have to worry about it. Below that, you'll have to use your own judgment and your own experience to see what you can do. But below that, you want to start thinking about using a monopod. You start getting down into any lower than that, you want to have it on a tripod that's like we have this on right now. You have to use a tripod for nighttime photography almost regardless, it seems like. There's things online that will tell you, okay, this is the shutter speed you should use for photographing cars with the wheels spinning and stuff like that. And if you want to know that type of stuff, there are some guides. Most people record cars, high-speed cars, at like 60, maybe 100 of a second. It just depends, because if you're tracking the car, or if you're as it's going by and you want to get that little bit of motion with the wheels, or if the camera's stationary and it's zooming by the lens, all that takes into account. That just comes with experience. I don't do a lot of moving photography. I take pictures of really fast moving things. That's usually all video. But that's why if you get into these ridiculous lenses, if this isn't too ridiculous, this is a 55 to 210. Right? At 210, you pretty much need a tripod. That's why you see those people with the big, long lenses, you know, the guys at the soccer events going like this. They at least have a monopod. You're never holding a camera. If you see someone holding a camera with a lens that looks like the Hubble telescope walking around, something weird's going on. So, because at 210, half of that's 125, so you're gonna, yeah, it's 350 shutter speed minimum. You can do it, but it's a little, you just have to use your experience to see what comes out. I never use this lens. I take pictures of birds sometimes with it, but excuse the hard edits. I'm walking around leaving the camera running. That large zoom lens has a really crappy f-stop rating because it's such a large freaking lens. Then you have this, which I shouldn't have done that. I got a little thing, but the macro lens. You remember we were taking a trying to focus on that mirror. This is a 3.5 30 millimeter macro. I don't know if you can see this because it's so shiny. It only goes down to 3.5 aperture, and that's why I didn't want to use it. It's a 30 millimeter. It can be used, and this does come off. Here you can get a better view. It looks goofy because it's kind of a macro. It's a macro lens. What makes it a macro lens is the focusing distance, the minimum focusing distance, which I don't know what that is on this lens. I'm not 100% sure what it is on the other one. But this has a very short focusing distance. You can have this lens this far away from something and it will focus on it. It will focus it into range. That's what makes it a macro lens, is the very short, for at least the rating for the millimeter. That has something to do with it. There are some macro lenses that are 35-40 millimeter that don't have quite as short of a focusing distance, but it's a higher millimeter, so it doesn't need to be as close. But that's the difference between a regular lens and a macro lens. There's not witchcraft going on that makes it so they can take really close pictures. It's just the focusing distance. The mirrors are different, so you can get right up on it and still get it into focus. That's really all that is. And a good macro lens, this is a decent macro lens. This is about a $250 lens right here. And it weighs like 5 ounces. It's steel or aluminum. It's all glass. It's actually really amazing. I like it a lot. Sony E-mount, obviously. But you can still use it as a 30 millimeter prime lens if you want. It's not good for taking video, as you saw with the last one where I was taking a video of that leaf. It doesn't. For some reason, this one doesn't like to focus in video mode. I don't know why. It'll focus right up and taking pictures. But it also has a manual focusing ring, which you have to use sometimes. On this camera, I have to hold the focusing down, and I have the camera set up so when I do that, if I do turn the focusing ring, it'll adjust. This bike needs a bath. Now that I got the Harley, this bike doesn't get ridden very often anymore. I really need to take it out here and there. That's pretty much all the basics. Like we might do a taking pictures of the moon, or maybe how to kill bees, or that might have been a fly. Plus, one of these days, actually, I found out we have some baby bunnies living under the steps. That might be fun to try to take some pictures of them. They probably won't be around long, because they grow up really quick. But there's all kinds of stuff I got planned. A lot of it's going to be rambling, but I can't really think of anything else. As long as you know how the basic things work, and you play with it, you'll figure it out. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, all kinds of stuff on the internet. Like Digital Rev TV, a YouTube channel. It's an Asian dude from England. It's in Japan, I think. That'll screw with your head. But they do a lot of fun stuff. There's all kinds of things. There's websites, and you can just start reading and reading and reading, and it goes on and on. But hopefully that clears up a little bit on how some of this stuff works for people that have been wondering, and like to see a motorcycle in the background. But till then, I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for watching.